I'm Kiersten Gawronski, and I'm going to be talking today about my German ancestors.
All right, so where did your family come from, and when did they come to Lenawee County?
So they came from Germany, obviously, and there's some dispute about the specific places in Germany. It's not 100% clear, but the two of the male patriarchs came in 1850. Lutz came from Stuttgart, Germany in 1850. Grandpa Lutz is how it's written here in the notes. But that would be, oh, sorry, I gave my copy of it to you.
Oh,
Yep.
Yep, here you go.
Thank you. So that would be Simon Lutz came in 1850. The other patriarch is George Traben. He arrived, there's not a whole lot of data of exactly when he arrived, but he came, it's labeled as Hessen in Germany, so I need to look that up. I don't know exactly. He came in about 1855, and so about the same time. The matriarchs, so Anna Marie, maiden named Weich, W-E-I-C-H, then married Simon Lutz. She came over in, let me look super fast, 1854. She came with the other matriarch, who is Christine Magdalene Scheibli Traben, and again at the same time they came over in 1854, and they're listed as coming from, I'm going to butcher these German names, but Augenbach, Ober am Kalb, Königgreich, Wittenberg, near Stuttgart. So that's what we have in the records. And they traveled together overseas, and they went directly to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they went there because they had relatives who lived there. The Scheiblis had a farm, Trabens had a farm, and already had relatives here. And so between the Simon Lutz and George Traben being here on the farm in Ann Arbor, then the women came over too. They were married after. They were married here in America, so they weren't married prior. And they met their mates once they arrived here. They didn't know them prior. But the two women were very good friends and knew each other. They came to Ann Arbor looking for work with a family called Verster, and unfortunately, the Worsters lost their money or were very poor, and so they didn't need any workers. So the housework wasn't available to them. So then Christine Scheibli, later Traben, decided to go work in Manchester. And we have this family note that both women went to Manchester carrying their belongings on their backs with them, walked the whole way. So from Ann Arbor to Manchester, they walked. I don't have any information about what Anna Marie did for a job, but Christine Scheibli Traben worked in a log cabin as the housekeeper of this cabin in Manchester. And family lore is that she hated it. It was very lonely, very isolated, and so there's a note that they came back to Ann Arbor, the two friends came back to Ann Arbor, and then at some point they came to Adrian, and we think the reason they came to Adrian is because Christine Scheibli Traben's sister was already in Adrian, and her sister was Mrs. Catherine Marks, M-A-R-X. And then while in Adrian, Christine Scheibli met George Traben in Adrian, and they married. George Traben had a first wife. I don't have any information about her. There were 41 years between the two of them, so there's a little bit of a scandal. Mm-hmm. And the note we have is that they built their home at 715 Toledo Street, which the house is still there to this day, as far as I know, to this day. So the other note we have here is they moved in before it was lathed. So basically they put up the walls, they put in a floor, and that was it. The family moved in. And really that stayed in the family until, I want to say, the 1970s. It was still in the family. The other thing I thought was interesting was that Simon Lutz, who came over, as I said, in 1850, the note I have here is that, first of all, he came over in a sailboat. I imagine it was of decent size, but still a sailboat. Took him 40 days, it said, to come over. And that he landed at a place called Castle Garden, which is the predecessor to Ellis Island. So before Ellis Island was set up, Castle Garden is where the immigrants came in. Yeah, so those 4 came from Germany. And that's how we got here.
Very cool. All right, and once they all got here, and you talked about the house on Toledo Street, was it more of like a huge family type of place where everyone lived, or were they kind of separated? Because I know Germans are very close-knit.
Right.
So we're just kind of wondering if they were all trying purposely to live within the same area, or did they all go to the same church?
Yeah, I think it was probably convenience. They're going to come to the area where they feel most comfortable. So that's, of course, going to be Dutch Hill. And they all, to my knowledge, attended St. Stephen. So the baptismal record of my great-grandfather is from St. Stephen. And, you know, I don't have any recollections of going there myself, but my grandmother would talk about, as children, they would see, because they lived so close to it, they would see people filing over for Christmas Eve services, and that there were candles, and they would go to the service and afterwards come home and have like treats like candy, and which was a big deal, you know, after the Christmas service. The Toledo Street house, I don't know how much of an extended family there was in the full area, and how often they visited. I know that there was a Lutz Bakery in downtown Ann Arbor, and it's now where the Blue Nile restaurant is housed, and that was Lutz Bakery. And I know that my grandmother visited with her parents, and was told that it was, you know, an uncle or a cousin. So there were some ties that were kept there. How many came down to Adrian to visit, I don't know how often that occurred. But 715 Toledo, like I said, since it stayed in the family for so long, as the grandchildren and then great-grandchildren and great-great, you know, they would still come back and congregate at that house. I know from holidays and, yeah, big events.
Yeah, okay, so let's piggyback off the holidays then. So you were kind of talking about Christmas time and what you remember. Do you have any personal memories or were told stories of holiday or German traditions that maybe they kept alive during the holidays, Christmas, Easter, or...
I know that they would go to... my mom tells the story of going to 715 Toledo Street, and that the relatives would all gather there, and they would, and I don't know that this was necessarily specific to Christmas, but they would do all kinds of, tricks isn't the right word, but they, for example, they would put the kids on, gosh, I should call her, they'd put the kids on an ironing board, and they'd have one adult at one end and one adult on the other, and the kids would stand on the ironing board, and they'd lift the kids up, and kind of like a trampoline almost. The kid wasn't bouncing on it, but they lift them up in the air. They would do things like, she'd tell a story about, they'd knock on your head, pretending it was an egg, like they'd take out a real egg and say, I'm gonna dump this on your head, and they'd knock on your head with their fists, and then they'd spread their fingers out like they broke the egg over your head.
My mom used to do that to me.
Did they? Yeah.
Wow.
Like those kinds of tricks, you know, they would do. I'm trying to think of anything I remember. So we'd go over to Lutz's, which would be my great-grandparents. They lived on Budlong Street at this point. And we'd go over and have, you know, holiday cookies and visits. I know that my great-grandmother Lutz would make sauerkraut. And, oh, God, the house, it smells so bad from that sauerkraut. So, yeah, I don't know. By that point, they were in their 90s. So, traditions would probably be better with my mom.
Okay. Did they speak heavy German still?
No, not at all. Okay. So, by the time my great-grandparents came along, the family had already been here. So, 1, 2, 3. So, yeah. So by the time I came along, they had already been here in Adrian for 4 generations. Okay. So, yeah, no German. My great-grandfather was a teacher at Adrian High School, a business teacher. And so he was very good with numbers and figures, very politically conservative. I'm just trying to think of, you know, there's some German stereotypes, and, you know, I think he kind of lent himself to those stereotypes. He was very tight with money and not very emotional. He was affectionate with me, but not a very emotional man. But he had a great sense of humor. He loved, like I said, Michigan football. He played Michigan baseball when he was at the U. Every day, or every Michigan game that he'd watch at home, I remember going over, he'd sit on the couch. He'd always have a Michigan tie on. He'd put his Michigan tie on just to watch the game. So, yeah. So, no German.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were there any, do you want to talk about other occupations that your grandparents had, whether you were necessarily around for them or not? But
yeah, so...
throughout the years.
So, Henry Lutz was my great-grandfather. He was the business teacher. And I was told, I've heard he was very strict. He'd hit you over the knuckles with a ruler if you misbehaved. His wife... Helen Lutz was a homemaker. Her mother, Isabel Rankin, owned a hat shop downtown, a millinery in the A.B. Park store. And Isabel's side of the family is where we have the Huff. So she's German. So Isabel Huff Rankin, her father was Christopher Huff, and came over to fight. Well, I don't know that he came over to fight, but he was here in Michigan and enrolled in the military for the Civil War, and fought for the Michigan, the 19th Company, I think it is.
Yeah,
B Company. And his occupation after that, I'd have to look. I don't remember his occupation. The occupation of, so Anna Marie Lutz married Simon Lutz. Those are the 2 immigrants from Germany. They had William Henry Lutz, and his occupation in 1910 is listed as a tinner, Tinner, and that he worked for a company in Adrian, I think it was in Adrian, called Lakeshore. I don't know how much money they made. In 1900, they had a boarder that lived with them. His brother Simon lived with them. He was a plumber. And his mother-in-law, Christina Scheibly-Trabend, lived with them as well. So I know he was a tinner. most of the women are, of course, listed as homemakers. But I think something that for the time period was really interesting is they're all listed as being able to read and write. So I know what's come down to me is the importance of schooling and going to college.
Right.
Henry Lutz, my great-grandfather, went to college. That was very important. And so even though these, ancestors, the ones in particular from Germany and then their children, may not have gone to college, they at least went through high school and were educated and could read and write. At one point I asked my grandmother, who is Mary Lou Lutz Pello, her father's Henry Lutz. I asked her about her recollections of her grandmother, Katie Traben, and she was always called Katie, but her birth name was Christine Catherine Traben. And so I asked for her recollections, and what my grandmother said was that Grandma Katie was always good to her, made doll dresses for her, was a good cook, came from Ann Arbor. So she had heard the story of how they traveled to Ann Arbor. The family was in Ann Arbor, is what I mean to say. She did tell me that Grandma Katie didn't get along very well with her daughter, whom we called Aunt Louie. Luella is her full name. They lived together for a long time in 715 Toledo Street, and so my grandma recalled that Grandma Katie didn't get along too well with her daughter. I can imagine, being a widow and living in your daughter's home who's unmarried can be a bit stressful. Always called Mary Lou's husband, my grandfather, his name was Edward Pello, always called him Mr. Pello-E. She'd pronounce the E at the end. And at times was ornery. So even though she was good to my grandmother as a child, I think as she got older, she got a bit ornery was the word my grandmother used. She said her husband worked for the railroad, so when I said that he was a tinner for Lakeshore, I think Lakeshore must be the railroad company. And that together, Grandma Katie and my grandmother would walk to the train station. So for example, if Aunt Louie went somewhere to visit, or when she came home on the weekends from teaching in Fort Wayne, they would go and meet her at the train station. My grandma recalled that Grandma Katie had a drawer full of ribbons that she would play with as a young child. And she recalled her grandfather, William Henry Lutz, which is interesting because she would have been about 15 when he died. So they had a relationship together for a while, quite a while. She recalled him as being very wonderful, and the comment she made was he was very active in St. Stephen's Church. So kind of reinforces the St. Stephen's Church, Dutch Hill. By the point where I was growing up, the generations had sort of spread themselves out. So Henry had his sister Frida Lutz Sisson, who lived in Tecumseh, and they had children that we would see once in a while. Henry's oldest sister Catherine lived in Jackson. Catherine Lutz McLaughlin, they lived in Jackson. We'd see them once in a while, but it was very sporadic. So it wasn't a super close family. I know, I'm going to start telling tales now, that my grandmother Helen did not get along with the rest of her husband's family, in particular his three sisters. And when I spoke to Uncle Jim, the historian, about this just last year, his take on it was that the three sisters, so Frida, Catherine, and Aunt Louie, we called Luella, were very close and tight-knit. And Helen was an only child. Her father died either before she was born or when she was very young, maybe one. And so she didn't grow up with any siblings. My grandmother, Mary Lou, described her mother as being very spoiled. Part of the family lore for that is that she wanted a fur coat, and this was probably the 1930s. My grandfather, as I said, was a teacher, and she wanted a fur coat and he couldn't afford it. And so she went to bed for 3 days and never came out of her room. And sure enough, she got her fur coat. So, you know.
That's all it takes?
Yeah, that's all it took. So my Uncle Jim's theory was that, you know, the Lutz sisters were so tight that it was difficult for Helen to really adjust. And there are other pictures where she's sort of in the background hanging back, and, you know, it's probably a lot of give and take. They were also very outgoing. Aunt Frida was just a wonderful, wonderful woman. There was an article in the Tecumseh Herald in the 50s where she decorated her house for Christmas, and it was really famous in Tecumseh for having these Christmas handmade ornaments. And Aunt Louie would make handmade ornaments, and I still have several of those.
Well, a lot of history in Lenawee is about Germans during both of the World Wars, and the discriminations and name changes they felt they needed to do, and also the POW camp. There's one in Blissfield. Are there any stories of discrimination or recollections of maybe POW camps, or did anyone have to change their names?
Well, I know that, for example, my great-grandfather, he went by Henry, but he, as you'll see on his baptismal certificate, is Simon Heinrich Wilhelm. He dropped the Simon, changed the Heinrich to Henry, and the Wilhelm to William. So there was definitely, you know, Anglicization. They anglicized their names, for sure. And probably to fit in, you know, my great-grandfather Henry, so he is in one picture in his sailor outfit. I know he enlisted in the Navy, and that picture is from 1918, and so I think, you know, I don't know his motivation. If I had to guess, it would be important for him to say he's an American. And I think that he took pride in being German, but it was never talked about or promoted or shared in great details. He definitely felt American. He was an American, very patriotic. And so that's my guess as to his enrollment. The other name changes that came, I think, came more for personal preference. So Luella became Louie. My grandmother, Marion Luella, became Mary Lou. So there were some preferences there. You know, I don't know that any overt prejudice was felt. I think because one side had the established hat shop and, you know, was a merchant in town. The Lutz side was very involved in the church community and in the city, and being a teacher, with Henry being a teacher. Luella was a teacher as well. Aunt Frida married Harold Sisson, who worked with the Tecumseh Herald. You know, so I think they felt very integrated and very American. Having said that, I know, you know, there's some stories about, in particular, Helen being a bit of a social climber, is how my grandmother always described her. I don't know that that had anything to do with being German, more than it had to do with socioeconomics and with her wanting to be part of the jet set of Adrian, such as it was. The story with that is that they dropped going to St. Stephen and became members of the Presbyterian Church. So it was like kind of edging into the WASP, you know, part of town, and trying to get ahead a little bit, and wanting to join the country club, and that fur coat story. And so, you know, I don't know that that necessarily had to do with being German in particular, but with St. Stephen being so strong ethnically German, to turn away from that and move to the Presbyterian Church was a very big deal. And so probably in a way you are denying a little bit of your cultural background to do that. Now they made the most of it. My grandmother Mary Lou, until she died this past March, was the longest living member of that church. So they were involved in that Presbyterian church for, 90 some years. But the motive behind moving to it is interesting to speculate about. So,
yeah. For sure. And so, I mean, you were saying that they loved being in America. They came here for a reason. They were Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably would, this question's probably better for the very first relatives that came here too. I mean, like, if they were to fill out a census, would they want to be considered German or German American? Most people that are actually born here want to be considered at least German American.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that some, maybe not by their own decisions, were termed Dutch. So I don't know if you had any.
Yeah, I always knew that they lived over on Dutch Hill.
Right.
But Dutch never came up. It was always German. The census, it has those that I could find listed as German. The one document on Christopher Huff has him listed as Prussian.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I didn't get any sense of Dutch. That never came up for me or in any stories I've heard of. Again, we don't have a lot of good records on those that immigrated over in the 1850s, but thinking back to my great-grandparents, Helen Lutz and Luilla Lutz, they were, Frida as well, many of them were really, really involved in Adrian, and they loved Adrian, they loved the history of Adrian. There's a book about the history of Adrian that Helen Lutz worked on, and they just, even though I think there was that pride or satisfaction in being German, it's just where their grandparents came from. And they just really, I think, my opinion is they felt really integrated into Adrian. It's a town they loved. Other than college, they never left and came back to. And for, most of the family members and generations as I was researching, they're all buried out at Oakwood. They were born in Lenawee County, or specifically Adrian. They stayed there, and they were buried there. And so Adrian is, I think, really tied to the family.
All right. So talk a little bit about the Pello name.
So the Pello family first came to Adrian with my great-grandfather, William C.S. Pello, William Charles Smithson Pello. And he was a minister, he was a Methodist minister, and he was minister in Detroit and then Port Huron, and eventually settled in Adrian, I want to say in the 30s, and he was, again, a Methodist minister at the Methodist Church in Adrian. And I don't know how long he was a minister there. I think it was his last job as a minister. His son Edward, who's my grandfather, Ed, he came to Adrian obviously when they moved from Port Huron, and my grandfather has sort of reached mythological status. He just was this amazing guy. There's a newspaper article about him hitchhiking across the U.S. when I'd have to look, I think he was 16, hitchhiked across the U.S. He didn't get along with his stepmother. His father had been married a total of 3 times. The first marriage was to Ed's mother, and she died quite young of an aneurysm. The second wife, they called the Battle Axe. That's all I ever knew was her name growing up until I kind of started researching. She eventually passed away. And then the third wife is someone I know as Grandma Ada. And Grandma Ada lived on Vine Street. They called her the Cookie Lady. She'd give out cookies to kids in the neighborhood, and she was wonderful. Well, when William was on his second marriage, Ed did not get along with the Battle Axe, and so Ed was shipped off to Howe Military School. And at Howe Military Academy, he met a man named Ken Herrick, and they became very good friends at Howe Military. They both graduated from Howe. Ken went on with the career in manufacturing with Tecumseh Products and all kinds of other businesses. And my grandfather originally wanted to be, or had pursued, I don't know how much he wanted to be, but had pursued a career in also being a minister. And so he went to a seminary in Chicago. He came back and was a minister briefly in Springville, in an area just around Onstead area, and just decided that was not his calling. And so intervening there was World War II, and so my grandfather enlisted in World War II. Prior to that, after the seminary, he was at Adrian. So after the seminary, prior to World War II, he was at Adrian and took classes, was a very proud member of the SAE fraternity. Yeah, and very involved even regionally and nationally with the SAEs. He worked for a while in Chicago at the headquarters. He met my grandmother, Mary Lou, there. At the time, he was dating another woman, another young lady. But as the story goes, so Mary Lou met them in what was North Hall, I believe. The old North Hall. It's not there anymore, and it's not even what it was when I was there. But met in the hallway, and supposedly my grandfather later told my grandmother it was love at first sight. He got on the phone and called it off with the other woman and went over to Lutz's. Lutz's lived on Winter Street at the time. That's where my grandmother grew up, was on Winter Street. Went over for dinner and that was it. They were inseparable. World War II happened. They got married, and my grandmother spent her honeymoon at I think it's Camp Blanding in Florida. And then Grandpa was overseas. He ran a dry cleaners, and so when he was in France, he also drove around some of the movie stars that would come for the USO shows, and so we have pictures of like Ingrid Bergman and Jack Benny and these famous actors at the time that would come around. World War II ended, and when he came back, he bought what I knew as Welch's Cleaners. I don't remember what it was called at the time that he purchased it, but bought Welch's Cleaners and ran a dry cleaning company for quite a while. Got involved in civic life in Adrian, and eventually a job came open at Adrian College, and it was in development. And so his job, and I'm sort of dumbing it down, but his job was basically to go around and solicit donations for the college. And so he would travel far and wide. The sculptor, of course I can't think of her name while I'm on the spot, the sculptor of the seals, it's called the Rookery, it's in the Science Building. Okay, he met with that woman, the artist, and got her to donate the Rookery and the Abraham Lincoln statue that's in the library. And I didn't know her until I really started to research. She was, very well known and ahead of her time. He would have people over, like Vincent Price came over for dinner at the house. People far and wide he would travel to meet to ask them for donations to Adrian College. Dovetailing back to Ken Herrick, they owned a quarry. They owned a quarry, and I want to say it was in Indiana. And so when Adrian College started to really boom, and I think it was the 50s, early 60s, Grandpa asked Ken Herrick if they would help contribute to the building of these new buildings, and that's why a lot of the buildings on campus are that same sandstone beige look to it that came from the Herrick Quarry, is what I've been told. So he worked in development. My mom would know the time period better, but I want to say for at least 10 years, if not longer, with President Dawson. He was very close to President Dawson, and he loved the college. Just loved it. Loved the aspect, loved the kids, loved the administrators, loved everything about Adrian. And he was told that he was going to have Pella Hall built as an honor to him. And he had an aneurysm. Not going to get this right, but he died in 1967. And he died in December. He had the aneurysm, I believe, several months prior. I want to say spring, but I could be wrong. And one of the last things he was told was that they were going to honor him with this building. So it's meant a lot to him and to the family to know that he knew that before dying. So, so the building, I think, was really built as a way of honoring him, the time he gave to the college, and all the money that he was able to bring in, and the building boom that they had. So that's it in a very quick nutshell.